Hey everyone, it's Mike Hughes from Lord of Minis at Lord of Minis on Instagram. We are back with our favorite mother, the Broodmother. She's our favorite because she's got a great smile. Last time we based and tackled the main face of our figure. We also painted the fleshy areas of the model, although we neglected her brood. Today, we are going to paint the bone and the various parts of her brood, including the eyes, hair, and fleshy parts. We're going to start with German Field Gray from AK Interactive Colors. I put the colors in the description, all of the colors we're going to be using today. This German Field Gray is going to be our base color for our bone. This is going to give us a nice green hue as we build up to a dark ivory color in the end. This will be the darkest of the colors for the bone. I like to use these sort of muted green colors as the base for any bone color, depending on what the color scheme is. If you're going for a richer, more saturated color scheme with bone, you can also start with, say, a Rhinox hide type of color, a saturated brown. This is what it looks like with the German Field Gray. It's completely covering our bone structures. Next up are the rest of the shades we're going to use for our bone. Faded green, warm gray, green gray, all from AK Interactive Colors, and Pro Acryl's dark ivory. We're going to start with the faded green with a little bit of the warm gray mixed in. So what we're going to do, you're going to see this is quite a bit lighter than our German Field Gray color underneath. We're going to build some structure in contrast around the bone. Again, not totally unlike the skin tutorial I've done. So although with bone, you can put texture in, you can see I'm adding some lines and texture. I would say you don't have to be incredibly accurate with this first pass. However, you do want to follow the contours. So whatever the raised surfaces are, wherever they are, you want to paint on those raised surfaces. You're not going to paint underneath the bone. You're going to paint mainly where the light is shining onto the bone from the top. And then again, you're going to see me follow the raised surfaces here, right here. And over the course of all of our shading, through the 4 shades that we have on our palette, we're going to build up contrast. So again, I'm adding some lines. And, you know, I like to add texture in like this for bone. In the end, sometimes we'll cover up a lot, you know, some of that texture, and the texture will recede into the other shades. But I like to give it sort of that texture, the underlying texture, as we add shades on top of it. So this is what it looks like the first pass. Again, don't have to worry a ton about accuracy. You just want to make sure that you get all the tops of the raised surfaces. You'll see that happening in here. Next up, we're going to add some of the green gray along with the last mix we had. And we're going to keep it relatively thin. You're going to see the consistency there. It looks a little watery. It's not watery, but it's not thick. So it's going to go on with this sort of more or less 50% opacity. You can see what I'm doing here is I'm going now really into the highlighted areas. I'm still covering quite a lot of the raised surface. When we go back in later with the dark ivory, we're going to build up our contrast with that really light color later on. But for right now, we're going to go over our raised surfaces. The one thing to note is we're not going over the entire area of our last coat. What we're doing is we're building up the lighter areas in a smaller and smaller area as we get lighter. So those raised surfaces, you can see I'm not completely covering our last coat. Again, you can build some line, texture, line work in, but it's really important to follow those contours of the raised surfaces as you go lighter. I should say today is a non-cheat day. So we're going to, I should have said this up front, we're going to paint this bone in shades versus the Broodmother that I painted to win the competition for Shadowborne Games in their Kickstarter project. That I used washes on the bone structure. Today we're not going to do that. We're going to paint everything by hand. So lucky you're getting a higher quality Broodmother out of this deal. I just think it's a good practice to learn how to paint without washes. I know I use them in various places sometimes, but if I can paint my miniature not using washes, I do that any chance I can get. So here you can see I'm painting the raised surface and I'm going into the creases. So you can see right up in there, I'm going into the creases. You want to go right into the top of the crease, wherever there is a crease, and then make sure that those raised surfaces are painted and contoured with that lighter color. And now we're moving on to our dark ivory color here from Pro Acryl. If you haven't checked out that paint line, it's absolutely fantastic. And now we're hitting the highlighted areas to add some contrast to our bone structure. It's important to think about the material as you paint it, whether it's metal, fabric, or bone, or any other type of material. You got to ask yourself, is it a material that's reflective, refractive? Does it absorb light? Bone does a little bit of both. It's not as reflective as metal, so you won't paint it quite as contrasty as you would a non-metallic metal. So, but we're going to add enough contrast in to give it some shape and form and make it feel, you know, you kind of want to make this material feel slightly dangerous, like it's a really hard material. So you can see we're just hitting the highlighted areas here, working into the crease and right on the top of the raised surfaces. If you really studied each one of these shapes, because that's kind of what I'm doing, as I'm painting, I'm really painting each little shape and adding volume to that little shape. So, you know, overall, it starts to come together in one form. You know, the tail's looking pretty good. Has a lot of contrast, but I'm really pretty much focusing on each shape as I paint it and giving each shape volume. I should mention that we're going to paint all of these bones on this base in a very similar way later on. It's just that that's going to be part of the basing at the end, and there's an OSL and stuff going into that, so we'll leave that for later. We're going to move on now with our warm grain saddle brown, and we're going to move on to painting our brood. We're going to kind of grab some of this German field gray, mix in it a little bit, just to slightly desaturate our brown color there. Baneblade Brown from Citadel is a good analog for this. So if you have that handy, that's very similar to the color I'm applying right now. So the color I am going for the brood is a slightly warmer color. You're going to see right now I'm simply adding some texture, some hair texture on the raised surfaces of the brood. You can see where the light is hitting the model. That's the area I'm working in. And again, I'm just adding more or less texture that's not present on the model, just to give it the illusion of hair, especially the brood on top of the model, where it's getting more light than the brood underneath the model or on the side of the model. So some of the brood I'm going to paint with texture, and then some I'm just going to be painting the raised surfaces of the ears, the tops of the head, the kind of like, I don't know what you'd call it, the snout, where the kind of the top part of the head meets the nose. So there you go. There's some texture on this one. You can also work along the contours of where kind of their legs are, so you can add some highlights around their legs. Again, I'm going to hit the tops of the ears. It's going to look pretty contrasty. I'm not working up in shades right now. I'm using a pretty light color to add volume, but also texture. And if you zoomed in close, you would see it would be the texture would be very obvious. And you could see by the video, the texture is going to be very obvious. Reason for this is that we're actually going to go in with an airbrush soon and airbrush a very light coat of mahogany brown, which is like a very warm. Actually, mahogany brown's a great color. If you guys don't have it in your palette, it's a really good color for adding almost like an orange brown warmth to anything. I use it a lot on non-metallic metal swords and stuff like that. So we're going to, again, paint the raised surfaces, it's going to be quite a feat here, guys, because I know we have to paint every single one of these brood, which is going to take some time. I'm going to spare everyone, although you probably would love to see me painting for about 18 hours straight. I'm going to paint a few of these and then do a little fast forwarding. You can see that I'm adding texture, but also if you kind of backed off, you can see that it starts to look like a little bit like highlighting on top. Now with these in here, I'm going to work the shapes a little bit more than adding texture. So you're going to see it's more about just pumping up some of those highlights. And I mean, the cool thing is that you guys decide what you want to do, add texture or just simply paint the highlights. We're going to try to get in close here to show you sort of just how textured this is or can be. This technique is kind of very similar to blocking and highlights if you're doing a non-metallic metal. I'm just sort of adding some texture into the highlighted areas. And if we zoom back, you can see how that's working. Nice highlighted areas across these brood. Starting to look a little better, a little bit more realistic. Looking pretty good. Nice texture on top. So we're going to grab some of our dark ivory color and mix in some water to make it about a 50% opacity. And we're just going to go in and just add a little bit of contrast to the highlighted areas, the raised surface. The raised surfaces. We're just gonna pump up some of those highlights there to give some of the brood some dimension. You're going to see as we move along with this project, we're going to always come back to this type of thing, just adding more and more dimension to our volume to each object. So right now I'm just trying to get enough volume and contrast on these brood so that when we move on now to our airbrush, that we're going to still see the texture underneath. So what we're mixing right now is we're mixing about a 10-to-1 ratio of thinner to paint. So I'd fill the cup about halfway with thinner and add 1 drop of mahogany brown. Mix that in. It's very, very light. And now what I'm doing is I'm hitting the brood from underneath and on the side. You can kind of see that mahogany brown warming up the side and underneath of the brood. We're also going to work this mahogany brown onto our bone structures here. We're going to work it sort of, where the bones meet each other in those little areas like that. We're going to go along the whole tail and pipe in some of this mahogany brown, some very, very thin coat. And this is really adding some dimension, but dimension with saturation. Instead of just having the bone color sort of one color going from dark to light, this is going to add some saturation in between the bone structures. Also, you can hit the tail a little bit with this. It's not going to affect much of anything because it's in the same value range as that pink on the tail. We're going to go back in to our brood here. You can see on the side right there. See? You can see where, if I turn around here, you can see where I'm adding all those brown tones. And I added some on the top of the hand to add. You can see it looks a little, it's like orangish brown. It gives a really nice transition on the fleshy areas, and it gives a really nice color to the brood, like a nice warm color. We're going to go now, and now that we've airbrushed the brood, we're going to go back in and rework some of the areas, some of the highlighted areas, and rework some of our texture. This is just using the same colors we did before. And again, just on the raised surfaces. And you can see that face really popping out now from the rest of the mix. And you can play around with that as well. If you want just a couple of them to feel like they're popping out into a light source, that's kind of cool. Here's what it looks like adding back in some of the highlights. And then if you went in real close, you can see that sort of warmth go over the bone in the creases. So we're going to move on to the eyes now. We're going to use AK's dark green, light green, and luminous green. We're going to leave out frog green. I have it here for no apparent reason. No, I have it on my palette, but decided that the eyes were so small that we didn't need a 4-color transition. We just needed the 3-color transition. So we're going to start here with our dark green, and we're going to cover the entire eye. Now we're going to go, you can see there. So we're going to do to every single one of these brood. Next, we're going to move on to our light green, and we're going to paint even less of the eye. We're just going to touch it like that. I'd say we're coating maybe, if the dark green was coating 100% of the eye structure, this is covering maybe 60%. Then for our last color here, just to give it a little extra pop, we're going to use our luminous green and really just give our eyes just like a little dot. I'm using a 2/0 brush, so a very tiny brush, and I'm just going to give it a dot just like that. That's what we're going to do on every single eye to make them glow. If you zoom in here, you can see the 3-color transition happening there. So a bit of fast forwarding here. All the eyes are done. You can see them glowing, looking pretty good. We're going to move on now to some of the fleshy areas using dark magenta from Pro Acryl. We're using Bordeaux Red from AK, which is great, and Brown Rose from AK. The Bordeaux Red is really great at the insides of mouths and things like that. This is a great palette for that. We're going to start with this Pro Acryl and paint the insides of our brood's mouth and some of the fleshy areas on their tail, as well as their hands. You can see the hands kind of popping out of the fur. So that's what this palette is going to be for. Next up, we're going to use our Bordeaux Red here for the medium shade in our palette for our flesh tones. You can see me adding Bordeaux Red to some of the raised areas. There's raised areas inside the ears, on the nose. Some of them have their mouths wide open, so their tongues. So we're just going to make sure we hit all of those raised surfaces. And again, I'm using like a consistency that would be akin to about a 50% opacity consistency, meaning water to paint, not too thin, definitely not too thick. I need to paint these hands coming out. So we'll do that in a second. But first, we're going to just make sure that all of our noses are accounted for. We're also going to take that Bordeaux Red and I'm going to add texture work along the tails. The texture's not there, but I'm going to add some texture. This is the Brown Rose. So this is the lightest color that we're going to go in with. And I'm going to actually pipe in some highlights kind of all around the model, working in the crease again here. So I'm going to work the Brood's nose, but I'm also going to, you're going to see I'm going to work the hand, the raised surfaces of her hand. I'm actually going to work some of the raised surfaces of the inside of her ear as well, her tongue. And I'm going to work some texture and highlighting into the Brood's tails. You're seeing that I'm working the highlight on her hand. On her hand, you can see the top knuckles are almost in this square-ish shape. If you were to zoom in real close, what I'm doing is I'm following those shapes. I'm hitting the tops of them, but I'm kind of following them along the sides of those little knuckle shapes, along the tendons in her hand, and then of course I'm going to be adding a little bit of texture across her hand there. So I'm painting the highlights on the hands coming out of the fur. I have previously painted the dark magenta color as the base for that. So I'm just doing some highlights for those hands. It's looking pretty good. I'm going to move on now to add some texture and highlighting to the tails. Working in the crease there where the tail meets the body and coming down. And I'm actually going to add another highlight that follows the length of the tail to make it look slightly wet. In order to make something look wet, you just want to give it enough contrast. So for the last part for today, we're going to take our dark ivory and we're going to rework the bone now that we've put some mahogany brown on there. We're going to rework the highlights and really build up the contrast at this point to make each volume really pop and look like bone. Again, we're just following the contours, the tops of the bone. So you can see how contrasted that looks and how the volume of the bone just looks like it's popping. That's looking pretty good. This is what we're going for here. And there's a little bit of texture left in there as well. And all that contrast is really built on top of the bone there. This is the end of Volume 2 of the Broodmother tutorial. Thank you all for joining me. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers.